Hi there, guys. So today I'm going to be presenting a little bit of information on Stuart Hall's cultural studies theory, and I'm going to be talking about an experiment that was done that actually showcased some really interesting new truths to the theory. So I'll just go ahead and get into this. So, introducing the theory. So, the cultural studies theories is defined by Griffin or our textbook as a neo Marxist critique that sets forth the position that mass media manufacture consent for dominant ideologies. And Stuart Hall is considered to be the founder of this theory, even though there are other people who definitely helped and improved upon the theory later. The cultural studies theory, though, can be defined into simpler terms that I'm about to get into. So I break it up into media analysis that is essentially performed and is done so for the sake of creating some sort of positive change in society or a good reform. And then there's also communication and criticism. That should really be used to change society, like I said earlier, and especially in terms of Hall's definition of exposing unjust use of power by those who control the media. So, whatever the media that you're getting is, you should try and see if you can change the power struggle in it. Alrighty. So, to elaborate on the theory a little more, Hall's theory overall focused on the aforementioned terms that I went over, but there are a lot of important components that I just wanted to discuss. So, we have ideologies, and that's defined by Griffin, our textbook, as being the mental frameworks different classes and social groups deploy in order to make sense of the way society works. So, in kind of simpler terms, Hall believed that people employ ideologies to create answers for whatever situations they find themselves in. And this is especially true for people who are disadvantaged, whether that be economically, because they're a woman, because they're a minority race. And they will use ideologies to make their treatment by those in power above them feel less unjust or just completely unfair overall. And then there are some elements of this theory that cross over with Marxism. Hall tended to have less emphasis on rationality, more emphasis on resistance, though, when you compare that to Marxism. I'd say that the truth of cultural studies is established by the ability to raise our consciousness of the media's role in preserving the status quo. Hall really focused on that. And then there had to be some sort of cultural analysis, especially, one that focused on power relationships, because if it wasn't there, then Hall didn't believe that it was, really good cultural analysis. Hall believed that the purpose of this theory and research was to empower people, like I said, who would probably be disadvantaged, living on the margins of society, having little say in the direction of their life, scrambling to survive. And then a fun fact is that Hall actually was so inspired by Karl Marx that he made the words on his tombstone to be, his mission statement for this theory. And then this is more simple. Meaning and discourse, Hall believed that if you had discursive formation, that you could create meaning through the discourse and the words that you were having through your media consumption and discussion. And then we have the cultural factors that affect the selection of news. And that's going to be your source of news, individualism, ethnocentrism, democratic process, objectivity. And this is a really big deal because we all know that where you get your news, completely shapes your ideology. And it's a really important thing to watch out for. Um, Same thing with an obstinate audience because this audience is usually the disadvantaged one, like I mentioned before. They will be operating in a dominant code, or they could be applying a negotiable code, or they could also be substituting an oppositional code. So in this case, they're either just kind of consuming what the media tells them and letting themselves be in their life, or they're going to be, you know, agreeing with some of it, not all of it, or they could just be disagreeing with all of it. And then this is a nice little checklist that you can have to evaluate this theory. So you need to see if there's a reform of society, there's a new understanding of people, clarification of values, qualitative research, aesthetic appeal, and the community of agreement. All six of these are very important, and you can definitely try and identify the, I guess, framework, and just like if the theory were to match six of these and all six of these elements, then I'd say it's a really good definition of the cultural studies theory. Alrighty, now we're going to move on to the study that interacts with this theory and actually showed a new truth. So this all focuses on a man named Andy, or excuse me, not Andy, Alan Sakal, and he wrote a scholarly article called a physicist experiments with cultural studies, and through this, it was interesting because from what it sounds like I've been saying and what I had gathered, the theory was pretty well defined, but this guy was actually able to, you know, showcase new truths about the theory because of the way that his experiment went. So the initial question. So Andy Solak was a professor from NYU's Department of Physics, and he wanted to do an experiment on if ideological perspectives would blind a person's ability to see clearly through visible logic and argument flaws, which can happen, but this is a much worse case of what actually did happen. Um, he wondered, would an article be published if it sounded good and if it was pleasing to the editor's ideological perceptions? So then he actually conducted the experiment, and Solak wrote an article that contained false logic and an inconsistent argument, but was worded really well and just sounded very nice on the ears. And he featured quite a few sources, and all of his sources were credited properly, and everything was perfect, but they just didn't have any, connections. And he submitted it to Social Text, a magazine, and it was actually published there. But his hypothesis was correct because the editors of the magazine didn't see his inconsistent argument and his logic flaws because they were too blinded by their ideological perceptions. And Solak even said it himself. They felt no need to analyze the quality of the evidence, the cogency of the arguments, or even the relevance of the arguments to the purported conclusion. All right. And here's what we can learn about the study and the results of it is that Hall Hall's cultural studies theory really focused on how important ideologies are. But here it's interesting because the editors of social text actually let those ideologies blind their ability to see logical fallacies. Um, so, in closing here, really, we can learn quite a few things from this, but we can learn that from this experiment, theories such as Hall's can have elements such as, maybe some extreme ideology that can be really misused. This can lead to logical fallacies from the user that can lead to large scale mistakes, such as the terrible journalism practices that social text did, and that's just flat out, bad journalism. You can't really argue against that. Um, but what we can really learn, I'll try and sum this up a little more, is we need to see how when we witness text and media, we can't just look at it from an ideological point of view of like, oh, this agrees with my ideologies. I agree with this. And also, I agree with this because it sounds nice or it's worded nice. We shouldn't do that. And we need to look for logic, like provable logic and strong arguments. We also need to focus on, like Hall said, supporting communication and criticism of media and justice. Positive change is always a good thing, but we can't blindly support the media due to our ideological perspectives. Because if we did that, we'd be allowing the media to continue controlling us, and injustice that we already have in our society is never going to go away. And we would then be committing a terrible injustice by doing the exact opposite of what Hall believed in. So make sure that you're analyzing your media and focusing on the arguments and the logic. And those are my references, and that's it. Thank y'all for watching.